fantasy short stories. The Acquisition by Corinna Underwood. Backing away from the docking port, Professor Freema Omanda tried to slow her breathing and look matter-of-fact so that the negotiators would not detect her excitement. In her 40 years as curator of the Intergalactic Antiquities Repository, she had never been able to get her hands on an acquisition of artifacts from the ancient world of Orthonia. The vast museum held only a single Orthonian artifact, was a small, nondescript ceremonial urn. Little was known about it, other than that it had been acquired by the museum's founder millennia ago, perhaps even before Orthonia became a barren world of ice. The lot that Freema was now so anxious to see had been shipped from an anonymous private collector, and she had no idea what it contained. It mattered little. Even if it was only another ceremonial urn, it would still put her museum at the top of the list this side of the galaxy for Orthonian artifacts. Ancient legends told that all light deserted the planet when it was forsaken by its protector, Nuva. When Orthonia's only son died, the planet quickly became a frozen wasteland. With its limited technology, the race lacked the ability to travel in space, leaving the few remaining survivors to be rescued by other nearby planets. Surviving generations had quickly caught up with space technology and had developed into a nomadic race dedicated to traveling the stars in a constant search for Nuva, in the hope that one day they would regain his favor. There were always rumors of valuable objects surviving, but no one had ever seen them. If this shipment was authentic, and Freema's knowledge of Orthonian culture was second to none, then it would be the peak of her career. The cargo hatch opened, and the negotiator stepped outside and bowed. Freema went through the formalities, swallowing down her impatience. Finally, he handed her the authentication chip and followed her into the cargo hold. She slipped the chip into her handheld computer and waited. "Professor Omanda, please proceed to examine the artifacts." The negotiator released a panel, and Omanda stepped forward. When she saw the contents, Freema forced herself to stifle a gasp. Slowly, she stepped up to the waist-high table. Laying upon it were 2 Orthonian artifacts. She knew she must tread carefully if she was to seal this deal and send her reputation rocketing out into the galaxy. She glanced over her shoulder at the negotiator, who remained at the door, and felt icy fingers trace the notches on her spine. Before her were 2 perfectly preserved bodies of Orthonian high priests in full regalia. On closer examination, the quality of the artifacts was so impeccable that her heart began to sink. Any remaining Orthonian royals would have to be found and contacted for clearance. There were rigid protocols in place. She could not authorize the purchase of such ancient antiquities, such that had probably been robbed from the sacred Orthonian tombs. Freema scanned her handheld, checked over the authentication data, and her spirits suddenly spiked. The documentation showed that the antiquities were indeed authentic members of the Orthonian Sacred Brotherhood. More importantly, they were being granted to the repository by the sole survivor of the Orthonian royal family. Freema closed her eyes and took a deep breath, bracing herself for the asking price. Orthonians were not renowned for their generosity. She turned and bowed to the negotiator. "I would like to begin negotiations." He bowed in return and held out another chip. "There are to be no negotiations. There is one offer, and one offer only." Freema swallowed and took the chip. This was a complete break from protocol. By the laws of fair trade, there had to be a negotiation. Legally, she could end this conversation here and now and report the negotiator. but she couldn't. She had to know what they wanted, to know if it was within her reach. She licked her dry lips, nodded, and took the chip. Turning away from the negotiator, she closed her eyes while she waited for the figure to come up on the screen. When she finally looked at the handheld, she could not contain her gasp. The figure was less than a quarter of her sizable budget, and only a fraction of the possible value of these artifacts. Is there a mistake? She showed the negotiator the screen. No, Professor Omanda, there is no mistake. She broke into a smile suddenly and held out her hand. Then I accept. The deal was sealed. On the way to her lab, Omanda's assistant, Verundi, buzzed through on the comm. His voice was high-pitched with excitement. Did we get it, Prof? Did we get it? What is it? As soon as I'm done with this class, I'll be down to the lab. The professor smiled. This was going to be almost as big a moment for Verundi as for her. It would blow his mind when he saw what she had just acquired, and it would certainly kickstart the student's career. When the artifacts went on display, visitors would be flocking to the repository from all the known galaxies. Perhaps she would even invite the surviving member of the Orthonian royal family for the unveiling ceremony. They had decided that their nomadic lifestyle was not conducive to the preservation of such antiquities, and her repository was certainly a safer home for them. It was already the biggest in the nearest 3 galaxies, and she had a feeling it would soon be growing even bigger. Once the artifacts had been teleported to the lab, Frima sterilized and set to work examining and documenting. The 2 priests lay head to toe, as though they might rise at any moment and begin officiating an ancient Orthonian ceremony. She had never examined such well-preserved specimens from any race before. She was eager to take tissue samples and assess the preservation technique. Judging by the design of the ornate headdresses, these bodies had to be at least 2,000 years old. All the facial and neck tattoos were still intact, with only minor skin discoloration. The headdresses linking the Nisian telepathic transmitter crystal to the forebrain were still in place. She ran her handheld over the length of the bodies, taking initial readings. The data from the first priest came back as expected. Preliminary analysis dated the priest at 2,500 years old. He had the usual Orthonian genome sequence and the typical Brotherhood telepathic enhancements of that era. The readings from the second priest were vastly different. Though the brother had the same enhancements, the date of origin was impossible. The readings showed him to be several million years old. The genome sequence was also completely out of kilter. Frima docked her handheld and ran a full system check. Everything was working perfectly fine. She ran the analysis of the second priest again and got the same wild results. It now seemed that the second priest was not authentic at all, but had been tampered with. It hardly mattered now. 2 Orthonian priests would have been fantastic, but even one was wonderful for the price she had paid. She decided to run a few more tests on the second brother. If he did prove inauthentic, she would have to file a detailed report, and the artifact would have to be incinerated to prevent any cross-contamination. Omanda pulled down her visor and set about taking tissue samples from the priest's inner lip. Suddenly, she noticed there seemed to be something in his mouth. She went back to her first artifact. Through its slightly parted lips, she could see that his mouth was empty. She started as Verundi buzzed her again, and then hit ignore. Moving back to the second priest, she injected a lubricating solution into his jaw and waited 40 seconds for it to take effect. As the tissue slackened, She carefully widened his lips and reached inside. Gently, she pulled out a small, circular object. It appeared to be some form of opalescent gemstone. It was golden in color and contained darker flecks that seemed to float beneath the surface. She lifted her visor to look at it more closely. Although it was customary for Orthonians to place a gem in the mouths of family members, this was taboo within the priesthood, and Frima was perplexed by the stone's presence. The object felt strangely warm, and she was about to swab it when it exploded and turned to dust in her hand. Cursing herself for lifting her visor, Frima rushed over to the Sterabe and bathed her eyes and face. It was protocol to call the medic, but her eyes looked and felt fine, and if she made the call, she would have to file a report on the article she had damaged. That would lead to her suspension pending investigation, which would keep her from working on the Orthonian artifacts and damage her pristine reputation. She rushed back to the bodies, rationalizing that the stone must have been compromised by the preservation process. She captured a few specks of dust and fed it into the analyzer. Within seconds, the machine told her that it was an unusual form of chrysorolite, a common enough mineral on Orthonia, but this sample also showed trace minerals that resisted analysis. This may have accounted for the stone's unusual inclusions, but still did not explain why it was in the brother's mouth. Belatedly, she pulled down her visor, disheartened by her carelessness. She tapped some data into her handheld and began a search of the museum's database for information on this odd mineral and its connection to the Orthonian sacred brotherhood. After a few minutes, her search came up blank, so she extended her search beyond the museum onto the intergalactic databases. Verundi buzzed in again. She flipped off the comm. Now she had to act quickly. On the one hand, she may have damaged an important artifact, but on the other, no one knew about it but herself. No one need ever know. Whatever the crystal had been, it was not worth compromising this exhibit or the prestige it would bring her. She set about erasing all information of the crystal from her records. Frima knew she didn't have long before Verundi came down to the lab. His class was almost over, and she wanted to make the most of her precious time alone with her prized acquisitions. She went back to her data collection, conducting a layered scan of each body. Without the presence of the mineral, both readings were the same, and as expected, meaning they were both 100% authentic, and it had only been the presence of the stone that had caused the anomaly. This also meant that she would be getting a very large salary increase in the very near future. Her handheld flashed, indicating incoming data. She glanced across at it. It read, Orgal, a rare form of Orthonian chrysorolite, believed to have been a sacred gemstone that had the power to bestow the wearer with the ability to control the will of others. No reported findings of the mineral exist, and many archaeologists believe it to be a myth created by the ancient Orthonian race. For a moment, Frima allowed herself to consider the prestige she would have attained for discovering the legendary Orthonian gemstone. Then Verundi buzzed in again. "I'm on my way," he cheerfully announced, and she suddenly found herself wishing he had other classes to attend. Omanda deleted the Orgal data from her handheld and incinerated all traces of the dust without a second thought. She had just started the tissue samples when Verundi teleported in. "Why didn't you answer? I've been... Oh my... You are not serious." His opalescent eyes flecked blue with excitement. "How did you ever manage to acquire these two specimens?" "It took a little negotiation, but I pulled it off." She avoided his eyes. "Now, let's get to work so we can get these artifacts exhibited." Although the readings were normal on the second artifact now, there was something about it that still kept tugging at Frima's attention. She scanned it again and chided herself. Yet somehow, the more she looked at it, the more she seemed to sense something. Something she couldn't quite put her finger upon. She leaned closer into the brother's face. Strangely, there was something about the sunken cheeks, the heavily lidded eyes that were beginning to look strangely familiar to her, despite his obvious non-human features. "Take a look at this, Verundi. Does it look different to the other one to you at all?" He pulled down his visor and slowly examined each of them in turn. "They both look the same to me. Why? What do you see?" "Oh, nothing really. I guess I'm just letting my excitement run away with my objectivity." But still, there was something, almost like... "Wait a minute, there is something?" Verundi beckoned her over to the second artifact. "This brother must have had seniority over the other. Look at the sacred sigil tattooed on his wrist." "Well spotted, Verundi." She went back to her handheld and entered the data, feeling irked that she hadn't spotted something so obvious. Another batch of data flashed in, and when she read the screen, she began to break out in a cold sweat. It read, "Orgal is the sacred ceremonial gemstone of Orthonia. It is believed that Nuva, the divine creator of Orthonia, having no form of his own, adopted the form of a gemstone in order to hide from his nemesis. The gemstone has been entrusted to the sacred order of the Brotherhood for millennia. The legend goes on to say that Nuva will one day take on a new form to avenge his people and return them to their homeland." "Something useful?" Verundi tried to see over her shoulder, but she turned away and deleted the data. It was just another legend. She kept telling herself over and over that she had not just destroyed a unique and ancient relic. The integrity of the gemstone had been compromised. Otherwise, it would not have crumbled right before her eyes. The Sacred Brotherhood should have taken a little more care of their charge. Still, she felt that she had just let a wonderful opportunity slip literally through her fingers. She went back to the second artifact again and peered into his mouth, as though another stone would appear. She shrugged. Even though it would have added to the exhibit, it was just the stuff of legend. She began to relax and started documenting the gemstones in the ceremonial headdresses. She hadn't got far when her handheld flashed more data retrieval. "Nuva's Revenge, an archaic Orthonian legend of which only fragments remain, tells of the planet's creator who took on the disguise of a sacred crystal so that one day he could take revenge upon he who stole the ceremonial chalice of the Sacred Brotherhood, the receptacle of the light of life." Beneath the data was a digital rendering of the desecrated chalice, and it chilled Frima to the bone, because she had seen it before. She had seen it every day of her life for the past 40 years. "I'll be right back." Before Verundi had a chance to question, she stripped off her gloves and visor and teleported to the Frelian gallery in the east wing. At the entrance stood a small but stately showcase, displaying a single and rather drab piece of pottery. She pressed the keypad and read the data. "A singular example of an ancient Orthonian ceremonial chalice dating back to circa 21,000 OA, acquired by the museum's founder, Ramartho Romuli." Acquired. That word could have so many connotations. The museum had existed for hundreds of thousands of years. They often joked that it was almost a relic itself. Back then, there would not have been authentications chips and permits. Everything would have been taken in good faith. Just how Romuli had acquired the chalice could never be known. The artifact had certainly brought him prestige and sizable funding credits from all over the galaxy to extend his museum, But had the Orthonians permitted him to take it? Had Romuli deliberately removed all records of the connection to Nuva and the chalice? Frima gave herself a mental shakedown. What was she thinking? Even if Romuli had stolen the chalice, no one alive could know or even prove it. She keyed her handheld in search of a source for the data, but the link was dead. She reminded herself that she had to think with the scientific mind that had earned her reputation. By the time she had teleported back to the lab, she was laughing at herself for even contemplating the idea that she had released an angry god into the museum. Omanda sterilized and gloved up. Verundi was absorbed with the tissue samples. Once again, she went to the second artifact. There was something elusive about him that held her attention. She dropped her visor and closed her eyes for a moment, focusing her concentration. She breathed slowly, determined to make an objective imagination. She opened her eyes. Clutching the examination table, she raised her visor and leaned closer. Her chest constricted. She cursed herself for letting her imagination run wild. For an instant, the face she was peering down at was the mirror image of her own. She closed her eyes again, swallowed, reminded herself that she was the curator of the oldest repository of antiquities in the universe. But when she opened her eyes again, the room began to spin, and she felt herself slowly falling a great distance. When she finally opened her eyes again, Verundi's concerned face was looking down at her from above. How was she going to explain to him why she had fainted? Vaguely, she wondered if she had breathed in contaminated dust from the gemstone. Frima struggled to get back to her feet, but her body was lead. She tried to ask Verundi to help her, but when her dry lips parted, all that came out was a whisper of dust. Then, a disembodied voice drifted across from the other side of the room. It sounded like her own, but the words were not those she was screaming in her head. "You need to come and take a look at this," Verundi said, looking over his shoulder. Frima tried to nod and push herself up. Again, she heard her voice coming from a great distance. "What is it, Verundi? What's wrong?" Paralyzed with terror, Frima Omanda listened to the conversation going on around her. "It's the second artifact, the High Priest. There seems to be some kind of anomaly. The genetic sequence is out of sync, and the dating is much too recent." "Yes, I noticed an anomaly earlier. I think this one is inauthentic after all." Frima Omanda fought hard to move, to scream at Verundi that she was here, somehow trapped on the examination table. Then suddenly, it was not Verundi's face squinting down at her, but her own, visor up, handheld poised. She was locked in stasis, terrified. Panicking wildly, she tried to tear at the air, to move her ancient limbs, and to scream for help. She was powerless. "Yes, I think you are right. The tissue samples appear to be contaminated." "What shall we do?" Verundi asked. Then came her voice, so soft, so final. "We'll have to destroy it." "Destroy it?" "Yes, you know the protocol. Contaminated artifacts must be incinerated. Who knows what might be lying dormant within it? You write up the report. I'll deal with this." From her prison, Professor Frima Omanda looked up and saw her own eyes staring down at her. Once blue, now they had a golden hue with darker flecks that seemed to float beneath the surface. She was slowly wheeled to the back of the lab. In a last frantic attempt to heave herself upright, one of the ancient arms slipped from the table. She willed Verundi to notice, but the entity controlling her body calmly replaced the limb on the table. Frima heard the doors of the incinerator open. No one heard her silent screams as she was fed into the flames. Karina is a British author currently residing in Rome, Georgia. She writes short stories and novels in the magical realism, mystery, and horror genres. She is also the author of Murder and Mystery in Atlanta and Haunted History of Atlanta and North Georgia, as well as the mysteries A Walk on the Darkside, Beyond the Darkside, and the forthcoming Return to the Darkside. So, I gotta say that a lot of horror stories I don't find that interesting. Monsters, serial killers, the normal fare just kind of bores me for the most part. But stuff like this, high sci-fi with that touch of Lovecraftian influence, dark gods, and revenge across the eons, I really dig that stuff. It kind of blurs the line between fantasy and sci-fi in certain ways that it tickles my brain. I think it's because it juxtaposes two very different concepts. The extreme high sci-fi of the story makes it seem like we know all of science. We have all the answers. But then you bring in these old gods that are something that science can't explain. Mix in a little bit of existential terror, and you're golden. I hope you guys liked this as much as I did. If you did, be sure to leave a thumbs up and a comment if you're on YouTube. And if you're listening to the podcast, I could always use more reviews over on Apple Podcasts. I'm Chris Herron, and that's it for today's Tall Tale TV.